is 12 o'clock in Brussels. So with that, I welcome all of you, dear festival goers, to the Ideas Festival session on the Startup Nation Standard, hosted by Allied for Startups in OPP. Now, I just wanted to start out with a bit on the logistics. So you have a chat function where you can ask questions directly to this panel, and that is not the same as the one called chat. The one where you can ask questions to this panel is the one called session. So please use that one for all questions you have. Just on the house rules for all the folks here, this is a public event and it's being recorded, so it is on the record. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Allied for Startups. We have an hour to discuss the Startup Nation Standard and what it would mean for startups coming out of COVID and for our economy at large. I would like to start by setting the scene very briefly and then invite panelists here to share their opening thoughts. Actually, while I'm at it, can I ask also my esteemed panelists to make sure they are muting their microphones when they are not speaking, so that we minimize the background noise. So after I do a little scene setting, I'd like all the panelists to share their opening remarks. I'll first like to ask Pēteris to share a bit about what's going on, what this is all about, and what we know already. And then I'd like to ask Liz and Dom, representing the ecosystem from both sides, the talent and the startup side, and the talent and the finance side, to share their views on this subject. As I've just alluded to, the co-panelists here are Pēteris Zilgalvis, who's the head of unit for digital innovation and blockchain at DG CNECT in the European Commission, Liz McCarthy, who's the head of Scale Ireland and a board member at Allied for Startups, and last but not least, Dominic Jacquesson, if I'm getting that right, who is the vice president at Index Venture for Talent. Starting off, I should, I think, introduce Allied for Startups as well. Allied for Startups is a global network of startup organizations, and our mission is to be the voice of startups in politics and government. We've been founded over 5 years ago, and we've been working on digital policies from GDPR to copyright to startup visas since then. And actually, startup visas have been a founding priority of Allied for Startups. So we're so thrilled to be talking about this as well today. We are proud to be a partner of this event, and OPP has told me they are a startup themselves, so we are always happy to be collaborating with startups like OPP and make sure they up their amazing format here. Let me set the scene to discuss for the topic at hand. Today we're talking about the Startup Nation Standard. But before we do that, I want to frame the discussion and address the elephant in the virtual room, or the reason we're not seeing each other in person. And that is COVID-19. 91% of startups felt their business impacted by this crisis, according to a report from a few months ago. And this is also feedback we've been receiving from our member associations, in that it's a moderate to a severe impact, depending on what ecosystem you're looking at. Anywhere from 10 to 50% of startups face immediate issues. Now, I mean, in the last months, Allied for Startups has been advocating that startups should be receiving the same support as other economic actors when it comes to, for instance, liquidity support from member states. We've also published some recommendations for startup-focused growth. So there's been a lot of focus on our side in making sure startup ecosystems have what they need to face immediate problems. But I think everybody here knows that the world isn't moving back to normal. Some of the changes we are seeing will be permanent. And if the world is in flux, it is also full of challenges and opportunities. This must be a moment for the startups to rise to the scene, to rise to the challenge. So the question really becomes, how can we make sure startup founders have what they need to grow and scale in this new reality? And given the European Union's ambition to build a greener and more digital economy, surely these plans should have startups written all over them. And indeed, as we've seen, the European Commission's answer, or part of it, is the EU Startup Nation Standard, which is a part of the SME strategy. And I'm quoting this from the website, has the goal of making Europe the most attractive startup and scale-up continent in the world. So we share this enthusiasm and we love the ambition. But of course, today in this session, we want to understand more closely what this is about, what measures we'd be talking about, and how we'd be doing this. So I think this is a great moment to pass the floor to Pēteris Zilgalvis from the European Commission to share a bit about what the Commission's ideas are, what the intentions are, and where we are at in the process. Pēteris, passing over the floor to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a very nice introduction. You quoted our ambition, and of course ambition is great, but we have to move from ambition to action to results. And this is what we're in the process of. You mentioned the SME strategy, where alongside initiatives like tech due diligence, regulatory sandboxes, another of my and our great interests, the Startup Nation Standard. What is it? And most of all, why is it going to be useful? I'm not going to say why could it be. Why is it going to be useful? Because we think we will produce results. Is that the Commission wants to ensure that Europe's dynamic tech-driven startups, so often the engines of economic growth, have the best framework conditions to scale and secure market share across Europe and beyond. We see that Europe is a very entrepreneurial continent. We don't start enterprises less than in other countries, and in fact, perhaps more, but we do have an issue with scaling. An issue there is the venture capital, the amount of investment. I just finished a seminar, a webinar on the AI blockchain investment fund, another subject, but aimed at helping to scale in those deep tech areas. But here, in close cooperation with member states and stakeholders in the Startup Nation Standard, we are going to identify and promote best practices that focus on making it easier to start up and expand across borders. We've got to make the most of the digital single market, I mean, this is one of our strengths, and without it, we're either medium-sized or small countries. We need the single market. We need to use it to launch globally with an ambition to move to global scale. We need to streamline, as the standard will look to streamline visa and residency applications for third country talents. This is something that was mentioned in the introduction, and as you see, we wholeheartedly endorse and hope in the conversation with the member states that this will also continue to be supported and the best practice really shown and acting as a guiding light. Also making the granting of employee stock options possible and more attractive. Again, something that the Startup Nation Standard will point to the best practice in Europe. And we do know that in some of the countries, we have some of the best practice in the world, but not all of the countries yet. And I underline the yet. Increasing access to finance for startups. I mentioned the AI Blockchain Investments Fund, something coming from our side, but more private venture capital, more investment, a capital markets union, more initiatives coming from the member states, hopefully coordinated, but aiming to really make this the startup continent. And to stimulate the uptake of such best practices, this is going to, after the discussion, launch in the EU Startup Nation Standard with this political initiative, which will call from commitments to member states to learn from such best practices, we have them in Europe, and to implement them at the local, regional, and national levels, and obviously also in European coordination. Our ultimate goal, as was mentioned, and I can underline, is that Europe becomes the most attractive startup and scale-up continent. And now we have to move to action and to results.
Thanks, Pēteris, for that concise but very useful introduction. I wanted to also, just having in mind this is a very mixed crowd we have here, ask you to maybe elaborate a bit on how this is kind of going to work, and what the kind of the timeline / pipeline is here, because what we already kind of can foresee is that this is not a normal law that the EU is proposing, because this is affecting many different areas, and this is a bit of a different mechanism. How is this going to work?
Precisely, as you mentioned, this is not going to be a regulation or as a in other parts of my life. I'm involved in the legislation on the crypto assets, on the Digital Services Act. No, this is going to be an initiative of cooperation, because there's very much in the lives of the startups, also going across borders, that is a question of subsidiarity, which we of course cherish as one of the principles of the EU. But the member states, in making their own decisions, can work very much together. So we will be working with the member states. I mean, this is partially a process that is still being finalized, partially because of COVID, which you mentioned. The SME strategy came out right before we all kind of moved to teleworking and stopped having council working groups coming together, and stopped having things like a Startup Nation Summit, which should have already happened under the German presidency, but unfortunately due to COVID was canceled. So working with the member states, identifying, which we're also doing on our side, what the best practice is, finalizing how this can be assessed with the startup community. And we've had a number of meetings, I think that you know of as well, with the startup community. And then moving, and then this is where also I'll be very honest and frank with you, a little bit of flux with COVID. We were planning to have a ministerial meeting of the ministers responsible for digital, something that has been known in the past as the Digital Days. Whether this is physically possible at the end of the year, whether it's a good idea to have it virtual, is not finally decided, but it should end in a political commitment, because again, there's ambition, but then there's action, and most importantly, there's results. So we can put something on paper or on the screen more precisely, not commitment to implementing it, not commitment to taking some of the hard decisions, and also the mission, also in our future spending choices. We're also in the discussions on the member states, both on the multi-annual financial framework and the recovery plans, which are being proposed by each member state. And this is something that my unit, my directorate, is also involved in the digital side of that dialogue. Then nothing is going to happen. So ideally, but with a caveat that we're a little bit of flux here with the situation on being able to meet, ideally finishing with ministerial commitments, also where the ministers meet eye to eye, but whether this is possible, we'll see. And then we move to a process with the community, obviously very closely in each country, across the countries, grading and seeing how these commitments are being adhered to, not in any kind of penalizing way. It's not hard law. We don't have that power. We don't want to have that power, but of really signaling what is the best practice. What should we all aim for, and what are the results? Again, really aiming for that. And that would be followed up, that would be implemented through a Startup Nation Summit. Startup Nation Summits, again, with a caveat on whether we can all get together in Portugal under the Portuguese presidency, or whether we do that virtually. We are planning and preparing, but as you can imagine, final decisions are not yet taken on.
Super. That's really useful to have that kind of the immediate action items in mind. I want to throw the baton to Liz, who's the head of Scale Ireland. Maybe also, if you could first introduce yourself and maybe take a step back and tell us a bit about what the situation is like for startups on the ground now, and maybe that can help pave the way for why we would think Startup Nation Standard is so important at this time.
So firstly, to introduce myself, my name is Liz. I'm the CEO of Scale Ireland. Here in Ireland, we are the startup policy voice, engaging with government on behalf of the startup community. And some of the types of issues that we've seen coming up are things we've all touched on already in this session, particularly liquidity. You know, we did surveys to see what kind of support did startups need. It was really around the liquidity piece. And we're seeing some interesting results coming through from one of our partners, Tech Ireland. So they have the database on, there's around 2,500 innovation-driven enterprises in Ireland. And we've seen that there's actually, in terms of funding, there's been more funding than before in half one of 2020, surprisingly. And actually what we're seeing is larger companies that have scaled, that have already raised funding from VCs and other sources, that they are getting follow-on funding to support them, to bridge them through the crisis. Whereas in contrast, a huge drop in funding for earlier stage companies, those newer companies that are just starting, looking to try and raise their seed round, haven't necessarily just yet reached product market fit, as you know, for a lot of these innovation-driven companies, that they are really finding it very difficult to access that seed funding. And that's why for us, when we're engaging with government for this next budget, there's a lot of noise, obviously. There's a lot of people who need support due to COVID. It's really looking to try and get those incentives right so that there is private money out there. There's money sitting in bank accounts that isn't gaining interest. People are looking to diversify their investments. And we're really trying to get government to increase and enhance the incentive scheme that is there to make sure that people will actually allocate their money to risky assets like startups.
Super, thanks for that introduction. Maybe to ask it in a bit more pointed way, is the EU, in your opinion, currently the best continent to start up and scale up? And if not, what kind of main legislative change would you love to see coming from the EU to get us there?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I think you know the answer when asking that. I think the EU isn't necessarily the best place to grow a startup just yet, but seeing the likes of the Commission really pay attention to this sector is really encouraging, and it's a strong signal to all of the member state governments. So I think there's a huge opportunity on our doorstep. As Pēteris said earlier, it's a very entrepreneurial part of the world. We're leading in terms of regulation and regulatory matters around all those critical areas in relation to technology and development of technology, and that presents a huge opportunity. But we definitely are falling behind in other places in terms of being able to scale. So we would definitely agree with the not optional campaign is something that we have been part of, and we think is critical. You know, right now with COVID, capital has been the issue. You know, with the withdrawal of cash from the market due to the uncertainty of COVID. But it's talent is key. Being able to attract and retain talent, and being able to grow your business by having the right people with the right skill set who could go and draw a very strong salary from a more established company. That is critical. It has been shown in all of the research. I'm sure Dominic will touch on this in a moment. We would really agree that that is in a more long-term manner, getting the treatment of share options right. And this is where something we've discussed with Allied for Startups has been around, it's the definition of what is a startup. And when we deal with policymakers, they're always really worried that they might open a loophole, which is a reasonable concern. And it's a question of how can they realistically bring in regulations that can actually benefit these smaller companies that have the potential to grow without opening up the opportunity for other types of companies or investors to take advantage that weren't the target. That's something we're keen to work with member state, but also at an EU level to find what's the right answer, what's the right solution.
Thank you. I have it already noted down that I'm sure there will be questions galore on the stock options. I just wanted to kind of bring one more element to you, Liz, because I've seen a statistic that over 20% of startups during COVID-19 have already pivoted with their business model. Now, I find that is an amazing kind of a stat, and that's something that I'm just going to kind of presume that I wouldn't imagine seeing that in any other industry. And these are startups who are kind of helping us meet the challenges that COVID poses. Is that something you kind of have seen as well? And wouldn't that underline the kind of necessity to make sure that these entrepreneurs have exactly what they need?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. You know, we're all in this area because we're passionate about startups, and we see that they can bring that they bring vis-a-vis other types of businesses with a more traditional business model, they're innovative. And part of their business model is being able to pivot continuously to understand what the problem is and to solve it effectively. So we've seen that in real time with companies here in Ireland as well. For example, a marketing executive just started with me. A young guy had his own startup helping musicians be accessed to be booked for events. Obviously, the entire market was dropped overnight. He quickly pivoted to enable musicians to make money online. So he has a passive income stream, and he's now doing some marketing with me. So it's those types of people that are identifying opportunities and quickly taking advantage of them. But unfortunately, they're not the ones that are knocking down the door of government, because they're getting on with things, and they didn't have to close their doors. They were able to quickly adapt to working remotely and using all of the tools to be able to work effectively and continue to operate. And so it's really a case of getting politicians and decision makers to understand that they can drive a lot of value, these types of businesses. They're not closing their doors. They're not shutting up shop on the high street. They are continuing to operate, and they've distributed workforces right across rural Ireland, which is something that is a big factor for us in Ireland. Issues with overpopulation, traditionally anyway, in the bigger city areas. These startups have people right across the west of Ireland working at high value activities and really bringing a lot of value to those local economies, which is something we really need politicians to understand.
Let me bring in Dominic here. Dominic, you are obviously seeing the financial side of the innovation ecosystem on a day-to-day basis. I hope he's not bolting just as I bring him. You're seeing it on a daily basis, and I would like you to maybe also start by introducing yourself, how you've been seeing at Index Ventures the COVID-19 pandemic impact the startup and innovation ecosystem. And then I'd like to, of course, follow up by asking you what kind of the best levers are for regulators to make sure that we are supporting startups coming out of COVID.
Sure, and thank you for that, Benedikt, and welcome to everybody. So just to explain a little bit about who Index Ventures is, we're a tech venture capital firm, that's VC firm, but we're very broad within tech, so it includes sort of B2B and B2C, but we're not particularly, we're not biotech or whatever, software-based tech. Geographically, we're 50-50 split between Europe and the US in terms of where we invest, where our team is, almost all where our investors are from. Almost all the stats were pretty much split down the middle. In fact, we're the only major VC operating in Silicon Valley that has its roots in Europe, because we were born in Geneva, in fact. Portfolio-wise, we've got about 160 investments or so currently. Just to throw out some names to give you some context that people might have heard of, both current and previous investments. So Adyen or Fetch or iZeppel, King, Revolut, Deliveroo, Ala, Cri in Europe. In US, those would include like Dropbox or Slack, or Sonos or Discord or Roblox or Patreon. Could sort of carry on, but just to give a feel in case there's something there, a hook that people might recognize. And just stage-wise, because it points to what Liz was saying and what you said earlier, we are multi-stage. We invest from seed stage through to growth. Our sweet spot would probably be what we call the Series A check, which would be the first, usually it's the first like multi-million, over $5 million sort of check to go into a startup. We'll usually take a 15 to 25% ownership stake, and usually we'll almost always take a board seat as well. But I'd flag up that when we invest, the founders will own more than we do. You know, so it's much more, it's us supporting the founders, not us taking ownership in any way, and taking control. So just to give some context to people, because I know we've got an audience I can't assume knows about the details of how the ecosystem works, financing wise. In terms of with the pandemic, I suppose, you know, there's obviously a lot that links with what you were saying earlier. Everybody else, the other panelists. Yeah, we saw our portfolio and the tech sector generally initially badly hit and in panic mode in the first half of the year. We've actually seen a pretty broadly strong recovery in Q3 that's kind of following that initial shock, particularly probably actually even a bit more so in Europe, because the US has had its real issues over containment strategies, and hopefully, everybody brings things under control soon. But we've probably had a slightly faster recovery in Europe, in fact, than the US so far. I suppose the point is that consumers and businesses have been moving online more than ever before, and that overall shift to digital has accelerated the overall prospects for tech sector. Obviously, there's a few subsectors which really are massively, sort of completely knocked backwards, particularly anything to do with travel and tourism, of course. And in certain other sectors, like the neobanks, have been having definite issues recently, some of them. But from what we've witnessed, the majority of subsectors are coming out of the crisis, if anything, stronger than they were before now. E-commerce continues to replace traditional retail. And obviously the biggest sector of e-commerce, groceries, has massively benefited through the pandemic, with people getting the habit of shopping online. And that shift, plus obviously the massive shift in remote working, has just driven an overall demand for digital infrastructure and systems across the board. Payment systems, analytics and big data systems, remote collaboration, all of these different things. Just to remind us, we're all attending this conference now using Hopin, which is a UK startup, right, which has seen explosive growth and demand through this pandemic. So there's been a lot of side benefits, particularly accruing. It's obviously it's a silver lining only to what is horrific, but tech has actually seen a lot of benefits from it. And obviously, I'd say another thing is that a lot of businesses caught out by the pandemic are now taking a very broad assessment of where else there are hidden risks. In particular, that includes cybersecurity risks. And that's another area where there's a lot of activity when it comes to startups, and there's obviously just a major tech subsector. And we've seen that because we're a major cybersecurity investor as well. And just across the board, all businesses now are looking more closely at efficiency and internal processes. They've had to, because everybody's taken a hit on the top line. And that inevitably means investment in software. And we're seeing that we're very heavily invested in business software. And a lot of those companies are now back on track. Obviously, you take out the growth they missed out on in the first half, they're now scaling sort of as if carrying on from then. And that's, HR systems, finance systems, marketing systems, whatever. So we've seen that. And just us as an investor, reflecting what Liz said, I think in the immediate panic basis, we were investing heavily in order to give a lot of both our companies and new companies runway. They're being hit by a massive cash shortfall, and everybody wanted liquidity and runway. So we were very active investing at that stage. Now it's sort of back to normal, really. Our investment pace in new investments is pretty much back to normal. But as I said, we're investing more. That doesn't take away from what you were both saying around the seed stage, very early stage. Getting a company off the ground has had a longer time to recover, and we need to protect those ecosystems. At the scale-up stage, financing-wise, sort of feel like that is pretty much, businesses returning pretty much to normal with a different mix of type of companies we're investing in. Obviously, as a result of the pandemic, it's benefited certain sectors, as I said, more than others, but it hasn't affected our pace of investing.
Thanks for that, Dominic. I have a second round of questions now for the panelists, which will be just one level deeper on one or two of the kind of elements that Pēteris outlined will probably be part of the Startup Nation standard. In the meantime, I'm encouraging everybody in the audience to, again, use the session function, not the event chat function, but the session function to ask your questions in written form. Pēteris, one of the things I know you are passionate about, and I mentioned is going to probably be part of the Startup Nation standard, is regulatory sandboxes. Now, this is a term which I've seen kind of used quite a few different debates. Now, if I was to explain maybe to an entrepreneur in our membership, how does this fit in with, for instance, becoming compliant with other EU laws? So would a regulatory sandbox mean I can kind of talk to my local authorities to solve or to get GDPR compliant, or how do we understand a regulatory sandbox in the context of the Startup Nation Standard and compared to all the other EU laws that, of course, are still there?
I mean, one of the things that's important to say about a regulatory sandbox, it's not deregulation, and it's also not regulating an unregulated area. It's in an area where, usually for good reason, there is licensing, there is regulation. This is banking, finance, data, health, mobility, transport, working hand in hand with the regulator, and I underline this is mutually beneficial because the regulator, the supervisor, knows even better and really with up-to-date info what is happening technologically, what is happening in the market, and the startup, the innovator, it can also be a larger company that's trying an innovative procedure, gets feedback on, in this area that's not prohibited, not specifically foreseen, like blockchain for something, AI for something. How can I comply with consumer protection or investor protection, safety protection? So it's very much a two-way road. And though there is a bit of a challenge in terms of capacity, because you can't overload a regulator, a supervisor with talking to everybody all day. They have some kind of other work than just discussing things to do. We see it from the experience that is in the member states and elsewhere in the world that it has been a positive experience. We are doing it in a way, you could say, in the European Blockchain Partnership in building the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure. We have 8 very real use cases that we're implementing with the member states. Again, blockchain is not prohibited, but also not foreseen in a law. And this is sometimes the difference that we get with a European entrepreneur, and there is difference, that sometimes a European entrepreneur wants to see it is allowed, not simply there is no prohibition. And this is something going back actually even to the first discussions in the Financial Conduct Authority, who in a way pioneered this. And I studied and wrote about it for the University of Oxford when I was a fellow there. It came from people who were spending too much money on legal compliance and having legal fees go that they could use elsewhere to comply to something that actually they were fine on, because it was just really a question that they were uncertain whether this innovation was allowed because it wasn't specifically allowed, as most things aren't. So, I mean, we think this is a good tool. It's not obligatory for the member states. Some countries have things called innovation hubs, where they have dialogues with investors, with entrepreneurs. We think that dialogue is something that is probably necessary. The form it takes, it goes to subsidiarity, but we will be launching as the startup, as the SME strategy, SME and startup strategy, as I consider it. We will be launching more initiatives at the European level. Again, not deregulating, not eliminating licensing. Piece of legislation, and it's a principle of European law. You have a margin of maneuver for proportionality. So where something assures safety, where there's consumer protection, there is room, especially if it starts as a smaller initiative that can then be scaled. There's a lot of room for a supervisor, a regulator, to allow for proportionality. This is not something that's going to crash the financial markets. This is not something that is going to cause the planes to fall out of the sky. It is something that we are trying in a controlled environment with real people, with full protection for them, but trying something new. So again, this is something that we really want to see as part of utilizing the innovation principle and a pro-innovation legal framework in Europe, while of course staying true to consumer protection, investor protection.
Super. The other part I wanted to dive deeper on is the focus on talent. in this Startup Nation standard. Now, for those of you who maybe aren't working with EU policy on a day-to-day basis, of course, there's a lot of discussion or pulling about competencies, and the talent is not usually something that is dealt with first in Brussels, because when it comes to kind of education and migration, this is of course often on the member state level. So it's kind of all the more interesting that the Commission does acknowledge the importance of talent and is therefore thinking in the Startup Nation standard of best practices to put forward when it comes to supporting talent in the innovation ecosystem. Talking specifically, of course, about startup visas and stock options, which Pēteris was mentioning. Now, I'd like to get both Dom and Liz's takes on where talent fits in as the puzzle piece, and how a nation standard could help alleviate some of the pressure points. Maybe to Liz, my question specifically would be, what's the situation like in Ireland, for example, when you are trying to issue stock options right now? And what could the best practice be that you would like to see? And similarly, maybe to Dominic, looking at the kind of portfolio of businesses you have, is there kind of any kind of particularly good and a particularly maybe bad example of how stock options could be done or shouldn't be done? I'll pass it over to Liz first.
You're mute.
You're muted, Liz. Liz. Test, can you hear us, Liz? The connection is quite rough. Maybe, yeah, maybe once, as long as we figure out, there you go.
Dominic.
While we figure out the acoustics, maybe Dominic, you can kick us off on the talent side of the Startup Nation standard.
Of course, and Liz, just feel free to just butt in when you're back. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I mean, at Index, yeah, we definitely believe that talent is fundamental. Which is funny because we're an investor and we're a provider of capital of the financial kind, but it's human capital which is the biggest blocker. There's a lot of money around, and money is a fungible commodity. Talent is precious and unique, and it's what makes the difference between successful and perfect.
Yes, you are back.
Yeah, so here in Ireland, with the share option scheme, there has been some improvements to the main one that's used by startups, the key employee engagement program.
Okay, Liz is going to hop on and off. Thanks, Dominic, for being so kind with giving a space. But if it's possible, I would still like to pass it back to you to continue, and as we figure out Liz's audio.
Of course, that's fine. Yeah, so you're right that obviously things like visas and other rules are a member state domain, but let's not forget freedom of movement is a EU benefit which has been fundamentally important for European tech, right? You go to a Berlin startup and the majority of people who will be sitting in the room building that company will be from other member states rather than from Germany, and that's the same elsewhere. That bringing people together and pooling our collective talent has been absolutely fundamental. But we also do need to look beyond the talent within Europe's borders, and particularly to the US. I'd say there are two particular things that we need to do. We need the tools to do so. First, we need the right policies and tools to be able to woo back European expats from Silicon Valley. We've had thousands of really fantastic, talented tech, both technical folks and commercial folks who moved to Silicon Valley rightly to pursue amazing careers with in the heart of the tech ecosystem. But we need to be able to bring that expertise back now, and we need to be able to compete to do that. And we also need to attract other US tech experts, particularly leadership talent, individuals who've really seen scaling at to the next stage beyond what we've been able to achieve so far in Europe, and to have those people help us build the next step of companies here. So that leads directly to these two policy areas. So the importance of having a friction-free visa system for non-EU skilled talent, and now sadly I'm sitting in the UK, crying, but non-EU skilled talent also includes people from the UK now as well. So that needs to be friction-free as possible, because that talent from US but also from UK needs to be able to move. And then the second thing, if we're going to woo back people from Silicon Valley, and if we're going to get the best and brightest to work in innovation and startups rather than moving over to Silicon Valley, it's fundamental that we have stock option reform as well. There's no way you would cry if you heard the types of, or if the types of salaries that Google, Apple, Amazon, etc. pay to even very young graduates. It's quite shocking. There's no way startups can compete directly on salary. Its stock options are the vehicle by which you can offer a stake in the company when it's very small and worth very little, on the hope that it becomes very valuable and it yields a large upside for that individual. It's a critical part of the whole Silicon Valley flywheel. We've got some great practice in Europe on the use of stock options, but we have some real impediments in much of the continent, and most of the continent, to be honest. Sometimes you can't even issue stock options because you'd have to give voting rights to option holders or people who exercise those options, which would make, and if you add that with the need to get notarized, signed agreement, if you have hundreds of employees who've been given stock options and suddenly you want to make a business decision and you need to get hundreds of notarized approvals, it's not going to work. Those sort of bureaucratic impediments need to be taken away. A key issue, because it obviously does link to tax as well, but it's even looking outside of the tax rates, which is obviously but even just like the timing of the tax, for the vast majority of Europe, if you have a stock option, if you exercise that stock option, you get shares in a startup, and that startup is illiquid. That's not worth anything, and the majority of startups fail. And yet you still have to pay tax in most of Europe when you exercise that option. So asking somebody to pay tax up front on an asset which may be worth nothing, or may take years and years and years before it's going to be worth anything, just seems fundamentally wrong, right? So even if the tax rate is high to support our high, strong social nets, etc., let's get it right on things like the timing. But I would argue that they should be treated as a capital gain as well, because you're effectively giving somebody an asset. It's an asset which can go up or down in value. We should treat it as a capital gain and tax it, therefore, at the point that you realize that gain, not at the point that it's granted. We're punishing our startups. So I could carry on, but those are key elements which we're hoping that can be reflected somehow in the Startup Nation standard as well going forward.
Liz, let's hope the audio works. I may try to unmute you. What's kind of the situation like with stock options and startup visas right now? What could be improved in Ireland? So
I fully agree with everything Dominic said. When it comes to stock options specifically, one of the biggest issues, and this is across the board for most policy issues that we would be advocating for change on, is that it's just hugely complex and hugely disproportionately difficult for these smaller companies to offer stock options, for example. It's okay if you're a very large company and you have a large office and a large amount of money available to pay for professional services firms. But often if you're a smaller company, that can take a huge hit to your bottom. So in Ireland, to navigate that scheme the most popular one, you have to instruct a services firm to help you to administer the stock options, which is a huge barrier to small companies that don't have a lot. And one example, a case of our steering group members, Mark Cummins, a very startup founder. He had previously founded a company, spin out from Oxford, and then he sold it on to Google, so he made a lot of money. Went again and was really passionate about providing share options for every one of his employees, and was able to attract people for a variety of reasons, including stock options. He was able to do that because he had the money available, and he understood the value of it and was able to navigate it. And then just last year, it was acquired by Google again. So that's an example of many, many people who are working for him now have a huge uplift, and they now have assets available to them that they can use for a variety of reasons. So it's actually distributing money. It's something that's enabling and empowering employees. It's not just about empowering founders to build their business. So we really think that it's really important that decision makers understand that it's these schemes are, and the complexity is the biggest barrier to use.
Wanted to give Pēteris a chance to kind of chime in on the talent side of this debate. And I've also, from someone who wasn't able to write in the chat function, received a question relating to kind of checks and balances and implementation. It's along the lines of how we can make sure that member states don't just say they're kind of going with these standards, but that they're actually doing them, and that they don't kind of pull back on some of these requirements relating to, for instance, a slimmer or more accessible digital bureaucracy later on. Maybe I'll shoot both the talent question and that one to you, Pēteris.
Yeah, I'll start with the shorter answer. I mean, that will rely on the startup community. I mean, the startup community are the ones who really can tell and can hold their elected representatives and us to account. So we really will want to have a regular process of receiving inputs from them. It's so easy to use the stock option. Is the startup visa, is the startup setup as smooth as it is purported to be? So that's the answer to that one. On the second one, on talent, I mean, obviously we've put it in a set of issues that we think should definitely be in the startup nation standard, and we see it as essential, talent moving around the EU. As someone who's been in Berlin and London and in Paris and other places, I mean, you're exactly right. A lot of the talent is from elsewhere in the EU, often elsewhere in the world. And also we need to probably move up more on attracting this best talent from elsewhere in the world. This is, of course, in many ways a national competence, depending on what you're talking about. So I underline again the subsidiarity and why this is a instrument of coordination and not of binding legal decisions by European institutions. But I mean, I think more and more of the member states are seeing this. And actually, Dominic made the reference to the European expat community, who we work with a lot also in various discussions in various organizations. And until this year, we've always had a European Innovation Day at Startup Europe Comes to Silicon Valley, where the European expats in Silicon Valley, or a large number of them, come together with the Commission, VCs from Silicon Valley, from Europe, European startups who are part of the Startup Europe Comes to Silicon Valley delegation. So it's partially engaging with them, but also this openness to have people, from that and other continents. As you say, I mean, it was striking to me. I think I was visiting one of the Silicon Valley unicorns during one of these missions in a previous year, and I think no one was a California native, and half the people were from Europe, and part of the other half were not American born, but in other continents of the world. So I mean, if we can have this kind of attractiveness in Europe, and we know we have the research, we have the education, we have a lot on the quality of life. if we can have a more conducive legal framework, if we can have better possibilities for scaling. I mean, we, perhaps being a little more humble now, we may not be the only place or the very best place, but I mean a prime contender for some really major startups to come in various tech sectors in Europe. And in perhaps my final words, I mean, we have to a little bit sometimes play to our strengths as well. So with the EU Green Deal, with green startups, climate neutral startups, we see the investments rising rapidly in this area in Europe. And the policy, the inclinations of many of our citizens, the natural environment around us, and the entrepreneurial energy can really work together for us to have some world beaters. But that doesn't mean we give up on the other areas as well.
Maybe just following up quickly on that. For those of us in attendance and for startup communities, how can we help? If we are passionate about some of these ideas, is it about making a meeting with maybe the Ministry of Economics locally and kind of just letting them know that this is something we really need? What's the best chance? How can we give this the best chances to succeed, Pēteris?
We are, subject to the caveat that these physical meetings have stopped, maybe restarted, and so on. We're going to start intensive discussions with the member states. Many of them are aware from the SME strategy that it's coming. What a Commission communication is a communication to the member states and the European Parliament and the institutions. So they've received it. But I mean, it always helps to hear from the local startup community because, again, they're your elected representatives, that they hear from people in their own country. Yes, we want this to be something that my country is going to be actively involved in. We think we have this best practice where we'd happy to see it pass around Europe. And then maybe there's these other things that we think could be improved and we could learn from one of the other countries that I name or perhaps would like to find out about. So, I mean, this is only great. This only mobilizes the momentum for startups, for entrepreneurship, for innovation in Europe.
That's a great point. I mean, a repository of best practices is only really as good as kind of the members that update it consistently, because who's to say that, the best stock option scheme today won't look maybe different 10, 20 years from now. There's a question from an audience member regarding whether COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the funding process of startups by VCs, or if it will have. And I realized this was, I think, addressed at the outset by Dominic and Elizabeth as well. But in case there was anything you wanted to add to that question, Dominic, I'd be happy to pass it over to you again.
I mean, what the funding process looks like is obviously been virtual for the last several months. I think we're doing now, more recently, we've had the first sort of situations where some of our team have been able to travel again to certain European countries to meet founders and entrepreneurs and get to know them and make sure that chemistry is there. But we have been making investments entirely virtually as well through this. And I think speaking to our colleagues at other investors, other VCs, I think everybody has adapted to getting comfortable with the idea of handing over millions of euros to people you've never actually met, which can be a strange thing at first, but it needs must. But I say that, but it's as much about obviously the entrepreneurs getting comfortable with giving a board seat and giving up equity in their company to investors they've never met. It's a two-way street. But I think we can adapt to that, and we are seeing some degree of normality returning anyway. So that's on the sort of actual nuts and bolts of what the funding process looks like. I don't know if that's exactly what the question was getting at, but as I said previously in my intro, our investment pace is now back to our normal, what we'd expect it to be as well.
In keeping with the spirit of the Ideas Festival, I also wanted to ask the panelists if you had any questions for any one of your co-panelists. Otherwise, I'd move into the last round. Is there any one of you who wanted to ask maybe Pēteris a tricky question at the European Commission? Okay. Please go ahead.
Side of the panel.
Kids are welcome too.
No, that's
okay.
fine.
Okay, so because this is the Ideas Festival, we are also all asked at the end to basically bring our key message to a point, since this is being recorded. So what I'd like you all to do is to kind of just as we close, to please say, what is your one big idea for startups or for the Startup Nation Standard? And this will probably be recycled in videos later on, maybe going in reverse order this time. So Liz, then Dominic, and then Pēteris.
So my one big idea at the Ideas Festival is to really reduce the complexity of regulations that are going to impact on startups, enable those young companies that have potential to scale to really provide the right benefits for employees and access the capital that will enable them to grow and become the future multinationals.
Okay, this caught me by surprise. I didn't know we were going to be asked this. It feels like quite a daunting thing. I'm going to throw out more as an aspiration to give something I read last week, which really made my jaw drop, and I think points to the opportunity here, which was that I read the Bank of America reported that the US listed tech sector, just the tech sector in the US, is now more valuable than all of Europe's stock markets combined, including Switzerland and the UK. Mm-hmm. Right? It's actually worth more, $9.1 trillion compared to 8.9 trillion. 10 years ago, it was worth a quarter of European stock markets. So in just 10 years, it's become a bigger sector than the entire European stock market, which it made my jaw drop. And it just points, I don't think this is going to change. Don't expect the next 10 years to look different. It's accelerating. And, we've absolutely, it just underlines Liz's message, with that sort of statistic, like raw statistic, we've got to do this. This is central, and if not the central thing, and this way our future lies.
I guess that's a nice lead in for something that I'd be happy to say. And the two priorities for President von der Leyen, or the President of the European Commission, are the EU Green Deal and the digital transformation. And this is precisely why it's needed. It's not because we want to turn a nice boulangerie or a nice experience in European nature in only a visual representation. We'll continue to love our and cultural and surrounding environment. But we need to have the digital players that can compete globally, like the sector in the US and in China. In fact, I again was in a webinar this morning that was on the investment gap on artificial intelligence and blockchain with China and the US. So yes, this fits also with our ambition. This is one of the two main priorities, and digital goes hand in hand also with implementing the Green Deal. And then I underline again that talent, access to finance, the stock auctions, and the ease of operating within countries and across borders. So I think this is the direction we're going to go in.
Thank you all for your input and for making the time available, dear panelists. Next week, Ursula von der Leyen actually will give the State of the Union address to share where we are at and where we're going. And as you mentioned, Pēteris, the green and the digital transition are top of her priorities. So what we've done 2 years ago was offer a drink to the dear trainees in the Place Luxembourg here in Brussels for every time startups were mentioned. And I think we might come up with a similar challenge this time around, because in our membership there's a strong feeling that green and digital transition shouldn't that be all about startups and startups as part of the solution? So we are so thrilled that this Startup Nation standard is in the pipeline, and want to throw our weight behind it. We're really enthusiastic about the talent focus in it. And we'll also, of course, be tuned in and encourage everyone else here to follow the State of the Union to make sure that startups get a fair mention and are emphasized as part of the solution and part of the green and digital transition. I think that kind of served nicely to put it all back into the bigger picture. From my side, I'd like to thank you all again for joining. Please feel free to reach out to us at Allied if you have any questions for the panelists, or if you'd like to be put in touch or have a query. I know that the Ideas Festival will continue now in different channels, so feel free to have a look around and see if there's a follow-up session you'd like to join. But that's it from our side. Thank you very much for joining, and au revoir.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.